In the late 1970s, a physicist sat with a puzzle he had been circling for years. The double slit experiment. Send a single photon toward two slits. If nothing tracks which slit it passes through, it behaves like a wave and builds an interference pattern over time. Watch which slit it actually goes through, and the wave pattern vanishes. It behaves like a particle instead. His name was John Wheeler, and his question was this: what if you could decide whether to watch after the photon had already passed the slits? Could you retroactively force it to have been a wave or a particle all along? The Internet has spent 20 years getting the answer to that question wrong. Wheeler pushed the idea further to make the strangeness impossible to dismiss as a lab artifact. Imagine light from a quasar, billions of light-years away. A massive galaxy sits between it and Earth, bending the light around both sides like a natural lens. That light can be observed two ways. Combine the two paths, and you're testing for wave behavior. Track which path a photon took, and you're testing for particle behavior. The astronomer's choice happens now. The light left the quasar before Earth existed. In some versions of this setup, the choice of experiment and the emission of the light aren't just separated by billions of years. They're separated in a way physicists call space-like. No signal of any kind moving at any speed up to light itself could connect the two events at all. Which is actually the useful part. It rules out, cleanly, any channel through which an influence could travel from one to the other. Whatever is going on, it isn't a message crossing that gap. Wheeler himself did use dramatic language. He spoke of a participatory universe and of observation playing a role in what we can meaningfully call real. That's a genuine, carefully argued philosophical position, and it's a different claim from the future changes the past. Wheeler was asking what role measurement plays in making a property definite. He wasn't proposing that a decision made today sends an instruction backward through time. Wheeler called it delayed choice in the lab version. For years, it stayed a thought experiment, vivid but untestable. In 1982, two physicists, Marlon Scully and Kai Druhl, proposed a way to actually build it. Not with the original double slit exactly, with something subtler, a quantum eraser. And in 1999, a team led by Yoon-Ho Kim ran the real experiment. Let's look at what they actually built. A crystal splits single photons into entangled pairs. Physicists call them signal and idler. Inside the crystal, one photon occasionally becomes two linked photons. Physicists call this spontaneous parametric down conversion. The signal photon heads toward a screen through a double-slit setup. The idler photon heads somewhere else entirely, into a separate arrangement of mirrors and detectors. Because the two photons are entangled, whatever you learn about the idler tells you something about the signal, too. If the idler preserves which path information, the setup behaves as though the paths are distinguishable and interference disappears. If that information is erased instead, interference can be recovered in the right subset of the data. This is the part that made it famous. The idler photon travels a longer path than the signal photon, so the signal photon hits the screen first. The decision about the idler, tracked or erased, happens after that. And when researchers later sorted the signal photon hits according to what happened to their idler partners, a pattern emerged. The hits correlated with erased idlers showed interference. The hits correlated with tracked idlers didn't. This is where the story usually goes wrong. Headlines love to say, this proves the future can reach back and change the past. That observing something later rewrites what already happened. It doesn't say that, and physicists have been correcting this in print for over 20 years. Even people working directly on related experiments have occasionally made the same mistake themselves, then walked it back once colleagues caught it. A 2019 paper in the journal Foundations of Physics carries the title, plainly, "The Delayed Choice Quantum Eraser Neither Erases Nor Delays." It's not a fringe correction. It's the physics community policing its own popularizations. Here is the actual mechanism. Think of it like a lost and found ticket system. Half a ticket goes in a box the moment an item is dropped off. The other half stays with a separate log, filled in later. You cannot match an item to its category, claimed or unclaimed, until someone brings the two halves together. If you look at the signal photon hits alone, all of them, with no reference to the idler at all, you see no interference pattern, just a blur. That never changes. And not before the idler decision, not after it. The interference only appears once you sort the signal hits into two piles based on which fate their entangled idler partner experienced. One pile, drawn from photons whose idler was erased, shows a wave pattern. The other pile, drawn from photons whose idler was tracked, doesn't. But sorting requires the idler data, and the idler data doesn't exist yet until the idler photon is actually measured. Nothing about the signal photon's arrival changes. The only thing that changes is which pile you're able to put it in once you have the second piece of information. No signal, no influence, no causal arrow travels backward through time. What travels is a correlation, and correlations can only be read once both halves exist. Physicists sometimes put it this way: no physical record is erased. What's unavailable is which path information. No influence is delayed in the ordinary sense. What's delayed is your access to the coincidence data that lets you sort what you already have. Wheeler's original question still stands, and it's genuinely strange enough without embellishment. There is no moment where the photon decides to be a wave or a particle, sitting in transit, waiting to find out which. The experiment doesn't support the idea that it carried one hidden classical story the whole time, waiting to be revealed. It's a joint fact about signal and idler together, readable only once both halves exist. The same structural question turns up somewhere entirely unexpected. Almost 2,000 years before Kim's experiment, a rabbinic teaching wrestled with a structurally similar puzzle. Not about photons, about the past itself. The teaching comes from the Talmud, Tractate Yoma, and it's attributed to a sage named Reish Lakish. He makes two statements about teshuvah, return, repentance. In the first, he says, a deliberate wrong, once repented, is counted as though it had been accidental. In the second, he says something stronger. A deliberate wrong, repented from love rather than fear, is counted as a merit. The Talmud itself flags the tension. How can these both be true? The resolution given is precise. It depends on what kind of return follows the act. Repentance out of fear recategorizes the deed as an accident. Repentance out of love recategorizes it entirely, as something that now counts in the person's favor. One classical commentator, the Maharsha, offers a specific account of how someone who returns out of love, he writes, is moved to add good deeds well beyond what the original wrong required. Those added deeds are what get counted. A later teacher, Rav Kook, pushed the same idea further. He wrote that genuine repentance doesn't just cancel the weight of the deed. It transforms the very intensity that once drove the wrong into a stronger love of what's right. The mistake becomes raw material, not despite what it was, because of what it becomes part of. Notice exactly what is, and isn't, being claimed here. The act itself isn't undone. Nobody is claiming the sin never physically happened. The past event stays exactly what it was, the moment it occurred. What changes is which category it belongs to, and that category depends entirely on something that happens afterward. The event is fixed. Its meaning, its place in the ledger, is not settled until later. Let's be precise about the parallel and its limits. This teaching isn't describing physics. It's a claim about moral accounting, framed inside a specific theological picture of repentance and divine judgment. Nobody involved. In writing, it was discussing photons. There's no evidence Wheeler, Scully, or Kim ever engaged this text. That connection isn't being claimed here. And the mechanisms are not the same mechanism, dressed in different words. In physics, which statistical subset a detection belongs to, cannot be identified until the coincidence data exist, a claim about when the pattern becomes readable, not a ruling on which interpretation of quantum mechanics is correct. That debate stays open. In the Talmudic case, the sin already happened, fully, as itself. What's revised is its standing, not its occurrence. What's actually being pointed at is narrower than that, and more honest. Both frameworks refuse a simple assumption most people carry without noticing, that a past event's full meaning is locked in, complete, the instant it happens. Physics says, what pattern this photon belongs to isn't settled until information exists to sort it. The Talmud says, what this deed amounts to isn't settled until a later act determines how to read it. Neither claims the past physically changes. Both claim something about the past stays open longer than intuition expects. Worth testing something adjacent to this directly, for a moment. Think of an old memory. Not a photon, not a sin, just an ordinary event from years ago. Has its meaning to you stayed completely fixed since the day it happened? Or has something you learned afterward, a later conversation, a later choice, changed what that same unchanged event now means to you? The event didn't move. Your relationship to it did. The facts held still. The reading of them didn't. Back to the lab, one more time. Wheeler asked when a photon decides what it is. The honest answer, decades later, is that the question itself needed rebuilding. There's no hidden decision point to find. There's a joint fact, only readable once every piece of. It exists. Two investigations, one about light, one about how a life gets weighed, both circling the same unusual shape, not the past, changing, the reckoning of it, arriving late. Ancient wisdom, quantum mystery, direct knowing,